So Dr. Bryce Dietrich is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Purdue University and a research scholar at the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. His research utilizes innovative quantitative, automated, and machine learning methods to analyze non-traditional data sources such as audio and video. These methods are employed to comprehend the origins and implications of nonverbal political behavior, including vocal inflections and walking trajectories, particularly related to descriptive representation and implicit gender and racial bias. He strives to enhance the accessibility of big data while his substantive interest remains rooted in American political behavior at both the mass and elite level. Today, Dr. Dietrich would present collaborative work with Dr. Melissa Sands titled Seeing Racial Avoidance on Virtual Streets, an extension of his earlier research published in Nature. Now I would like to pass the virtual mic over Dr. Bryce Dietrich to present his work.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the inaugural Visual Media Symposium. As someone who spent the better part of 5 years at the University of Iowa, I have a fondness for the university as well as Iowa City, so I'm always glad to be back, even if it is in a virtual setting. So let me quickly share my slides to get us started, and then we will move from there. So the origins of this work began with and a simple observation that I had when I was at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, completing my PhD. So at the University of Illinois, we had this thing called the quad cam, which essentially was a 24/7 stream of the quad at the University of Illinois, where you could see kind of everyday social interactions day in and day out. So at the University of Iowa, they have a similar type of camera called the pentacrust cam. That is a very similar setup where you get to see complex social interactions over the course of a given day. So I became fascinated with this footage, both as a methodologist, but also as a social scientist. From a methodological standpoint, video data itself is incredibly difficult to deal with. And a lot of work prior that had been done in video data and subsequently often thinks of videos as sequences of images, which they certainly are. But a lot of the analysis is things like counting the number of objects like the American flag in frames within a political ad, so forth and so on. What's fascinating to me about pedestrian detection and object tracking, which is what I use in my work, is that it truly is a video-based measure in every sense of the word, because the measure would not exist without videos, because you're not interested in just the number of pedestrians in a given frame, but you're interested in their social proximity to one another. So for me, as somebody who was originally trained in network science under Wendy Cho at the University of Illinois, I became very interested in these social networks as they formed over the course of a day and what it meant for social organization and social structures. But working with Melissa Sands at the London School of Economics on a number of projects, we began to think more about this concept of avoidance using similar types of data. So simply put, avoidance is something that we all experience on a daily basis, and certain groups in the United States experience avoidance more than others. And these have profound implications for their own understanding of themselves, as well as their positioning vis-a-vis one another, both in physical space, but also implications in terms of their social status, et cetera. So what I'm going to show to you today is first our main published work out of this project, as it was alluded to, that was published in Nature Human Behavior with almost a year ago today. And then I'm going to talk about how we're expanding upon this study using virtual reality, and specifically the Envision Center, which is a center at the University of Purdue, at Purdue University that is dedicated to virtual reality research, especially with respect to social science applications. So before I get into this, we just had a solar eclipse. So I just want to make sure that if you're in some sort of plant-based captivity, please be sure to post that into chat. We can certainly send help if you need it. 2 blinks for yes, 1 blink for no. But assuming that that is not the situation, when thinking about executing an experiment using the type of footage that we saw on the Pentacrast or on the University of Illinois quad cam, the data set that I really got excited about for this project was a collection of hundreds and hundreds of traffic cameras that exist on the streets of New York. So these are still publicly available. You can go to NYC, the NYC Department of Transportation, search for traffic cameras, and you can see many of these. And so what really fascinated me was that I could be a researcher. At the time, I was at the University of Iowa, who could be watching this footage from 1,000 miles away and see kind of everyday social interactions on the streets of New York, and began to think about different ways that we could harness this to ask interesting research questions. So the reason why these are important is that beginning with Goffman in 1971, and even perhaps earlier than that, how people relate to one another in space often reflects societal norms, biases, and power hierarchies. Neighborhood racial composition can also shape this type of behavior through either contact or threat negotiations, meaning that the same type of social interaction that you see in a racially homogenous neighborhood will produce a different type of reaction than in a racial heterogeneous neighborhood. So the experience of encountering someone of another race, ethnicity, or social class in a public space also affects decision-making. My co-author, Melissa Sands, has a PNAS article that demonstrates this very clearly using an experimental design in which, again, people were randomly placed on sidewalks, and the people who were passing by them were surveyed shortly thereafter, and she found that the way that people dressed affects public opinion towards things like welfare and other social programmings. So it really does have an effect on political opinions as well. So the broader point of this research that I'll talk about a little bit more when we get into our the findings is that I've presented this work in a variety of different settings, and probably at least half the time I encounter someone who is from a marginalized group, often it's people of color, who will say that this type of avoidance is something that they have experienced not only in their lives, but they experience on a weekly, if not daily basis. Whether it's somebody, them sitting on a bus and somebody choosing to sit elsewhere, or it's somebody crossing the street when they are walking down the sidewalk. Those types of that type of avoidance has a profound effect on their own understanding of themselves and also their positions within society. So just because so it's important to think about these beyond just like academic literature on these issues, but more so in terms of how it affects everyday life. So the research questions in this study is, how do members of different racial groups behave towards one another in public spaces? How does this behavior vary across different neighborhoods and racial settings? And how does it play out in public spaces like city sidewalks? So the research design we did was a pre-registered field experiment for the study, where we had selected 2 neighborhoods. One was predominantly white, which was the Upper East Side of New York, and the other one was racially heterogeneous. And these neighborhood designations were determined using census block data prior to the experiment to select not only neighborhoods which had these features, but also neighborhoods that had usable traffic cameras, meaning a traffic camera that was focusing on a sidewalk within a neighborhood instead of a roadway. So we then selected phenotypically white and phenotypically black young male Confederates for the study. The control condition in our study had nobody standing on the sidewalk. We implemented a Brock randomized design over the duration of a single day in the summer of, I can't tell you off the top of my head. I think it was the summer of 2014, 2013. I need to double check the paper, but we did it over the single day. And we used Brock randomization over time. We had one day that we executed the experiment in the Upper East Side. And then within about 2 days of that, we executed the experiment again in Midtown Manhattan. So the main measure, which is going to be the focal point of my talk today, is changes in pedestrian behavior or avoidance as measured about the actual positioning of individuals on sidewalks as they place past the people that we randomly assigned. So here are the NYU students who helped us with the study. So the phenotypically black NYU students are shown on my left of my screen, and the phenotypically white NYU students are shown on the right hand of my screen. NYU has nothing to do with it beyond we just found a very helpful undergraduate research assistant at NYU to help us with the study. And that individual was able to recruit all of these other individuals to help us administer the experiment and also do some other things on the ground. So to give you a better sense of what the experiment looked like in practice, this is one of the frames. There it goes, 2017 was when it was done. This is one of the frames of the experiment in the Upper East Side. So we chose a single space on the sidewalk, as indicated here with the red arrow. We told our two Confederates to stand at that location and have a casual conversation about anything that was not politics. We then positioned them across from a baseline object, which will become important here in a second. The baseline object in both instances was just a wall. And then what we're interested in is manually tracked pedestrians, which in this figure is shown with the blue arrow. And the extent to which those individuals deviated or gave greater birth to their walking paths in the presence of our African-American Confederates. So we had 4 pre-registered hypotheses. So the first one is something that I think is very important for this type of study. Melissa was less excited about it, but we tested it nonetheless. So we called it the extraction avoidance hypothesis, which is essentially when we put people onto the sidewalks, we can actually physically move Confederates, or sorry, change the walking trajectories of pedestrians. So on its face, this doesn't seem all that interesting, but to me, it's pretty fascinating that I can put things on sidewalks and change the walking trajectories of thousands and thousands of people over the course of a day. That type of intervention just kind of blew my mind at first when we were conceptualizing the study. And it's simply a proof of concept demonstrating that putting people onto sidewalks actually has this change in the behavior of people as we anticipated. The ones that are more interesting to us as social scientists is first hypothesis 2, which is the racial avoidance hypothesis, which shows that pedestrians will move further away from Black Confederates as compared to white Confederates, which is, again, the thrust of the study. But as I alluded to, we also thought that this relationship would be influenced by the neighborhood that it was surrounding these individuals. And so because of that, we registered the neighborhood outgroup salience hypothesis, which was that the wider birth predicted by hypothesis 2 would be more pronounced in predominantly white neighborhoods. And then lastly, hypothesis 4 was a pedestrian outgroup salience hypothesis, where we predicted that the wider birth that we anticipated in hypothesis 2 would be more pronounced among white pedestrians. So the reason why all of these hypotheses are not only important to advancing our understanding of a different type of nonverbal behavior and how that matters for a variety of social implications, it's again important to just to pause for a second and remember that finding evidence of any of these types of hypotheses, specifically H2 to H4, implies that when African Americans are standing on the sidewalk, it could be friends of yours, it could just be students that you have in class, that even in a city like New York, which hails itself as being a liberal bastion in many ways, that even in those cities, if we find evidence of this, then it suggests that on a daily basis, that people of color experience very different things in these public settings than people who are not of color. And to us, that's just a very important thing to demonstrate. Now, Melissa grew up in the New York City area, and she can assure you that the Upper East Side is very different from a political standpoint in Midtown Manhattan. So we can't really paint a broad brush across the city of New York. But I think that this general concept of avoidance is just very important for us to really recognize what that means for the people who are being avoided when we think about these types of hypotheses. So the 3 hypotheses that I'll be showing to you today are H2 to H4, which again are the more interesting ones, if you will, even though in the appendix we find strong support for hypothesis 1 as well. So the way that we recorded this experiment, I think, is just, it's really kind of mind-boggling that such a thing is possible. And so what do I mean by that? So when we conducted this experiment, I was actually in Los Angeles. My partner is a transplant surgeon, and she was completing her fellowship at Cedars-Sinai. So I was spending the summer in Los Angeles. So the way that this experiment was done is that we had an NYU undergrads administering a field experiment on the sidewalks in New York. I was in Los Angeles. The servers in which this experiment was being recorded to were at the University of Iowa. and my collaborator was in Boston, Massachusetts. And the fact that you could do such a thing with the way that computers could be interacting with one another in real time, I thought was just really amazing at the time. And so what this figure shows is essentially how we set up everything on the day of recordings. So in the, where to start? So Elise, which is the name that is tagging this little audio clip in the bottom right, Elise was the fantastic RA that we had from NYU who really helped administer the vast majority of this experiment when we launched it. And so the way that she would set up the experiment is that she would call in, and I would record that audio, the audio recording of her call, as the experiment was happening. So this would be a video, and then Elise would be speaking over the top of it. And so the reason why Elise had to speak over the top of it is that one of the things that we wanted in this experiment was the race of the people who are passing our Confederates on the sidewalks, and we wanted a real-time measure of that. So we did a little experimenting of this in Iowa and elsewhere, and we found that it was very, very hard to label this after the fact. So especially with this type of angle, which this is the Midtown Manhattan location, it's really, really hard to infer what the race is after the fact. And so we wanted to try to code it in real time. So the way that we decided the easiest way to do it was that we would have Elise call in, position herself relatively close to the experiment, but in like a hidden location. And she would just narrate the video as the experiment would happen. And so she would say, there's a person walking by the two Confederates with a backpack on. That individual looks like a white female. There's somebody walking by right now. They're wearing a Yankees cap. That individual looks like an Asian man. So that type of annotation we found when we started in the Midtown location was very, very good, but very hard to keep up with multiple different characteristics. So after the first block of our design, we decided that Elise should only focus on whether or not she thought the people passing our Confederates were white or were African American, were the two groups that she ended up labeling. But what that allowed us to have is essentially a real-time label of the race of a particular racial category of the pedestrians in real time over the duration of the experiment. I think that this framework could be done, and I hope to do it again at some point, in the exact same way, but you would essentially have to have RAs assigned to each racial or gender category that you're interested in, and you would have that type of narration happening over the cross of separate computers. But we were able to obtain pretty reliable measures of the race of the pedestrians, or at least this one racial category, that we ended up validating using the Midtown Manhattan location, or sorry, the Upper East Side location that had a much tighter camera angle that was easier for us to make some sort of inferences about gender and race. And so in the appendix, we have validated this measure using some hand labeling that a graduate research assistant did after the experiment had been conducted. So the measurement strategy, which I promised I would return to, is also one of the innovations that we did in the study, because the problem with this type of design is that you're looking at a two-dimensional image, but you're trying to estimate a three-dimensional treatment effect. And so in that context, depending on where you're at on the camera, so if you're closer to the front of the image or the bottom of the image, versus if you're towards the top or a more distant vantage point from the camera, pixel distance means very different things depending on where you're at vis-a-vis the camera. So if you're closer, a pixel change is going to mean something different than if you're further away. So that type of 3D, 2D mapping is a real hard problem to deal with, because unless you know the camera angle, the zoom rate, the type of lens, you can't really back that out mathematically. So there are different strategies that you can use within the computer vision literature by creating essentially a 2D, 3D mapping using lat-long coordinates, et cetera. A lot of those techniques are not designed for this level of this type of resolution with respect to the data. Most of those things are designed for mapping 2D, 3D images onto GIS data from satellite footage or whatever the case may be, not really trying to estimate distances that are less than a meter or less than, a couple of feet, depending on how you want to measure it. So the measurement strategy that we came up with was essentially, if we put the Confederates across from a baseline object that has nothing to do with the treatment, And so in this instance, in both instances, it was essentially a wall. Then we measured the distance from, in this instance, pedestrian 12 to the wall. And then we take the distance between that distance and the distance from pedestrian 12 to our Confederates. And then the difference between those distances will back out the treatment effect, because the error rate that's associated with this 3D, 2D translation at any point in the image is going to equally affect the distance from pedestrian 12 to the baseline object as it will pedestrian 12 to the Confederates that we placed on the sidewalk. So I'm going to walk through kind of the limitations or the challenges of that here in a second after I walk through the results, and talk about how we tried to address that in this paper and how we're trying to address that using virtual reality in our most recent study. But this is a really interesting problem as a methodologist. And it certainly was a lot of fun to think about in the context of the study. I like our solution that we provide, but there's a lot of different ways to think about this. And I've seen definitely other creative applications or creative solutions to this exact same problem. So in order to get the manual tracking data, in order to get the manual tracking data for the study, or the tracking data for the study, I had a team of research assistants. All of them were undergraduates at the University of Iowa, who manually tracked every pedestrian in both the Upper East Side as well as the Midtown Manhattan location. If you're savvy enough, you'll notice that this particular image is not one of the two locations that we used. And what was kind of interesting about the study was that we scouted 3 different locations for each of our racially homogeneous and racially heterogeneous neighborhoods that both had cameras as well as the right racial composition at the central block level. And so on the day of the experiment, where we were trying to do what was supposed to be the Upper East Side, this was the one that we used to do a little piloting with Melissa, and basically Melissa by herself walking through these streets just to see what it would look like on the footage itself. On the day that we did our study, this camera had moved, so it was no longer facing this location. So the Upper East Side location was actually the second location that we scouted on the day that we did all of the initial piloting. And I'm really glad that we did, because the experiment would have been really challenging to do without identifying additional locations. But each of these coordinates will give you XY coordinates in 2-dimensional space, and the track number is individual pedestrians. So pedestrian 1 was present for 3 frames, pedestrian 2 was present for 3 frames, so forth and so on. So once you have manually tracking data, you get something that looks like this, where you have little numbers over and little dots over each of the pedestrians. And we're interested in the extent to which those pedestrians deviate from the baseline object versus the versus the Confederates as originally described. So this is the only results figure that we present in the study. There's a lot of other results figures that exist in the appendix. So what I'm showing you here is a difference between standardized distance to Confederates versus distance to the baseline object, also standardized. So the standardization that is occurring here is what we call the closest point, which is what the measure that we pre-registered. We pre-registered the experiment, which is essentially you take the point at which the pedestrian is closest to the treatment area, as we called it, which was the area in which the Confederates are standing across from the object. And then we only take the distance at that point, and we ignore all other distances that that exist on the sidewalk. Now, in the appendix, we replicate the results using all of the distances, and they largely look the same. But we focused on the point that was closest to the treatment area precisely because we think that this is not only is this the point where we should see the largest effect, but it also, again, puts everybody kind of on the same playing field, so to speak, when it comes to measurement. So the other standardization that we did to reflect these distances is that we divided the distance measure that we calculated using the manual tracking data with the full distance of the sidewalk also in pixels. And so what this will give you is a % deviation with respect to the size of the sidewalk in which the Confederates are standing. So the black line in this figure is both sidewalks. So that's a pooled analysis with both the Midtown and Upper East Side location together. The darker gray is the Upper East Side, and then the light gray is the Midtown Manhattan location. And then finally, in the conditional treatment effect, we also include a control for the race of the pedestrian, the gender of the pedestrian, the group, which means that we, in the Midtown Manhattan, in the Upper East Side location, we had an RA go through and manually identify whether or not groups existed in that data set. For the Midtown Manhattan location, we did the exact same thing, but we used a clustering algorithm to identify groups on the setting because there was a lot more pedestrians in that particular section of New York. And then we also included a control for the time of day. In all instances, what I'm showing you is the mean of the treatment effect, and then the standard deviations. These skinny arrows are 95% confidence intervals, or the skinny lines are 95% confidence intervals. The thicker line are 90% confidence intervals, and these are using clustered standard errors around the block of each assignment because it was using a block randomized design. So the first result is that pedestrians deviate on average 3.3% of the width of a sidewalk, or around 4 inches in the presence of Black Confederates, which is consistent with our second hypothesis. Consistent with our third hypothesis, we also find that on the Upper East Side, pedestrians move away between 4.6% and 6.2% of the sidewalk width, or between 4.5 and 6 inches. In Midtown, the pedestrians deviate around 3% on average, amounting to about 4 inches. So across all of our different sections, at least with the conditional treatment effect, we find significant differences between Black Confederates and white Confederates in terms of pedestrian deviation. Notice that the dark line for the Upper East Side, which would be this one, and the Midtown location, that these two lines overlap. So there is no significant difference between the neighborhoods, but the point estimate for the Upper East Side is slightly larger than the point estimate for Midtown Manhattan. So we have a larger standard error at the Upper East Side than we do in the Midtown Manhattan location. But the point estimates are consistent with what we pre-registered, which is that in the Upper East Side, where you have a more racially homogeneous neighborhood, you should see a larger treatment effect with respect to pedestrian deviation of vis-a-vis African Americans and white Confederates, consistent with our hypotheses. So in general, with respect to this study, like I said, we find really strong evidence with respect to the obstruction avoidance hypothesis, but I'm not showing you that here. We found statistically significant evidence for racial avoidance hypothesis, meaning that when pedestrians tend to give significantly wider berths to Black Confederates versus white Confederates in the experiment, we find evidence that's consistent with our neighborhood outgroup salience hypothesis. Yes, but it's ultimately not significant. In terms of the difference between Midtown and the Upper East Side. And we also found some evidence that non-white pedestrians, or predominantly African-American pedestrians, that white pedestrians tended to give a greater berth to African-American Confederates standing on the sidewalk than a non-white Confederates, or non-white pedestrians, which is consistent with our fourth hypothesis. Even though, again, in this instance, it's consistent with our hypothesis, but for the most part, it's not statistically significant, which means the only one that we can say at this point that we have statistical significance for is our second hypothesis, which is the main hypothesis of the study. So the contributions of this particular study is that real-world evidence has shown to shape racial context of behavior. Individuals systematically change their behavior in observable ways in the presence of racial minorities. And this is even in a dense, highly stimulated environment like New York. And then we have some evidence that this effect is moderated by broader neighborhood characteristics, as well as the demographic characteristics of pedestrians. And we've developed a methodology that can be used anywhere that public cameras can capture pedestrians in their feeds. And in fact, I know at least one other study, a study that was published within the last 3 months that replicates this exact same result using race-based treatments in Istanbul. And so this type of framework can be generalizable across these types of studies. Now, that said, I want to be honest about the limitations of the approach that we presented and why, to us, virtual reality is a great opportunity to try to rectify some of these problems. So the first is, again, this 3D 2D mapping. So again, we argue that the positioning of the Confederates across from objects unrelated to the treatment, we can cancel out this 3D to 2D error but that's still a concern, and I will show you how we validate this in the New York City study. But ultimately, we'll find that virtual reality is a much easier way to measure things like distance within that type of setting. We also argue that avoidance is implicit of bias, but we don't have a direct test of that in our study that we published in Nature. And also, we have no test of whether or not this has a broader impact on opinions, political opinions, similar to what Melissa Sands did in her 2017 study. We don't have that with this study. We just simply show that avoidance is happening, and we try to make implications of why that would be relevant, but we don't have a direct test of implicit bias or anything else related to public opinion in response to that. So the way that we validated the first measure is that in the appendix, I'm very proud of this particular element of the study, even though I never really get to talk about it. And so the way that we validated the study is I essentially created a 3D model that was the experiment. So what you're seeing on the left is the 3D rendering of the Midtown area that we use for our study. So the peg in this 3D model is the Confederate that is standing on a sidewalk in this 3D model. And then I use agent-based modeling to essentially move these little figures that are all approximately 6 feet tall along this virtual sidewalk. And the reason why that's useful for this type of study is that on panel A is the camera angle that we had in our study. In panel B, you can rotate the angle in this 3D simulation to directly above where the treatment is happening, which then cancels out the 3D, 2D problem, because now you're looking at a 2D representation of the 3D treatment effect. And now it's no longer 3 dimensions because it's only 2 dimensions because it's directly on top of where the experiment is happening. So in the appendix, we show that using this bird's eye view, as we call it, we replicate all our results in the study. And this is the correlation between the bird's eye view and the Confederate distance that we calculated using our own approach in the study. And we find almost perfect correlation, which suggests that this idea of canceling out the error between 3D and 2D mapping, as we suggest in the study, has some validation. So the 3D, using virtual reality, you can actually deal with both of these problems simultaneously. So first, with respect to limitation number 1, within a virtual setting, you can get very precise measurements of where people are within the actual virtual simulation. So this idea of a 3D, 2D mapping is not a problem in a virtual setting because you know exactly where they're at within respect to the simulation. The second thing that's interesting about a virtual setting, a virtual reality, is that you also get other information that we've honestly not thought about too much with respect to our pre-registration, but it's certainly something that we're thinking about actively, is this idea of the gaze of the person within the virtual reality setting. So prior to avoiding somebody that we put on the sidewalk, what is it that that individual is looking at immediately before that? And in the literature, there's not a lot written about kind of gaze avoidance as we're describing it. And so we don't really have any strong hypotheses at this point about what we should expect in this, but it's something that we are working on through the pre-registration process.